Just going to do one more thing before we get started because I always forget to turn the waiting room off. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Friday for the fortnightly Burning Platforms. My name's Peter Lewis. I'm the director of the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology. And this is my favourite part of every fortnight when I get a chance to talk about stuff that I want to know more about and I know is changing the world we live in a very rapidly, at a rapid rate of knots. I'm joining you from Gadigal land here in Sydney on a day where the rain's lifted, and I do want to pay respects to the traditional owners, recognise the land was ever ceded, and as I say, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And joining us today is my regular partner in crime, Digital Rights Watch Chair, the wonderful Lizzie O'Shea. G'day, Lizzie.
Hi.
And subbing in for his boss, who chucked a sickie, Josh Taylor, who is one of the myriad writers at The Guardian that dabbles in tech, but the one that probably knows more than anyone. Josh, thanks for joining us as well.
Good to be back.
And our special guest, Professor Toby Walsh, an expert in artificial intelligence, whose new book, Machines Behaving Badly, is due out next week. And as we have just discovered, this is the first outing of his ideas. So absolutely honoured to be in that position.
Pleasure.
So for those of you that are new to this format, hopefully most of you have been here a few times. We spent the first half hour kicking around the latest week in tech news, and then we dive deep. We're going to dive deep into some of the ideas behind Toby's book in the second half hour. But Toby, feel free to join us as we have our wild ride around the world of tech, and it's been a wild ride this week. I thought I kind of wanted to make this week an Elon free zone, but I also feel that it's been such a big thing that we'll say it's an almost Elon free zone and just have a really quick hot take from everyone on what's happened here over the last fortnight. I think a fortnight ago we were talking about Musk taking a significant stake, but not kind of going all the way and taking over Twitter. And I don't know, Lizzie, what do you make of it all? Hot take.
I do not like Elon Musk. I think it's bad when he purchases what is essentially, or seeks to purchase what is essentially a bit of digital infrastructure that we rely on to facilitate public discussions. Our ED James for Digital Rights Watch wrote a nice piece in Overland, which I've just posted in the chat, talking about why we're concerned about this. But yeah, I would love to be in a world where we talk less about Elon Musk, I have to say.
Josh, got a hot take?
Well, I actually think part of the reason for his wanting to purchase this is so that we talk about him some more. It's very sort of trying to get attention, I think. I thought that this was going to go ahead earlier in the week, and now I'm seeing more and more signs that, just the financing aspect of it might be a little bit more complicated than people might have imagined, and the fact that Tesla shares have been going down and the fact that the deal is entirely funded through debt could mean that it just falls apart in the next couple of days. And he seems to be kind of posting through it as though he doesn't care if it keeps going or falls apart. So
a professional troll, I feel.
It's got the right platform. Toby, what's your hot take?
I've actually met Elon, and I think he should stick to his goal of getting rockets to Mars and not. I wouldn't give him the responsibility of policing one of the most important town squares that we have left.
And I guess my hot take is just that despite all the hand-wringing, no one will actually leave Twitter if he does take it over. And that includes you, Lizzie O'Shea, because I know it's your platform of choice.
It's my platform of choice for distributing cat content. I never made out like I was going to leave. I don't think that really solves our problems. I mean, there's plenty of other platforms who are owned by bad people. I think let's get billionaires out of the digital infrastructure space. Or Digital Rights Watch did, for sure. That's true. I mean, that was around the media bargaining code, but the decision by Facebook to try and influence that legislative debate by removing all news content, which we thought was just highly irresponsible at a time of a global pandemic. But yeah, there's definitely an argument to be made that while these platforms are in the hands of billionaires, we need to make our work as advocates and community builders more resilient by not relying on the whims of billionaires to be able to succeed. So we certainly look all the time for ways to do that and use other platforms than Twitter, but we don't have a plan to to leave Twitter at this point. So we'll see.
You. Let's get into the news of the week. I thought I'd kick off with you, Josh. We're in the middle of an election campaign. You're doing what journalists do and sort of investigating the national interest from a variety of issues. You were telling me that you've been looking at the National Broadband Network and that boulevard of broken dreams. What are you finding?
Yeah, so we did a call out to our readers not that long ago, asking for them what some of their big election issues were. And the one that sort of came up a few times and has kind of flown under the radar this election was the NBN. And it's interesting because we're now at a stage where, you know, the government 2 years ago declared that the rollout was finished, but in the intervening couple of years has spent all this time and money essentially now going back and upgrading a whole bunch of different parts of the network that they said were fine a couple of years ago, and filling in a lot of the gaps. And a lot of the feedback that we were getting was along the lines of that, say, for example, people who got fiber to the node were finding that they weren't getting the speeds or reliability of service that they wanted. People who were on the fixed wireless or satellite were saying both of those technologies are far too congested. And now you can tell that the government was seeing that this is going to be an issue for them. So just prior to the election, they announced they'd be moving a whole bunch of the satellite customers onto the fixed wireless and upgrading the fixed wireless, which would make both services somewhat better. And they've also started doing upgrades to fiber to the node to full fiber in certain areas. And then in a very classic this government move, they've also got a grants program that they've been running for a couple of years now called the Regional Connectivity Program, which basically, in addition to funding a whole bunch of mobile towers and things like that, in select areas, it's quite successful in sort of getting certain areas upgraded to full fiber in a lot of places. So I wrote a story a little while ago about how Barnaby Joyce and a business in Barnaby Joyce's electorate got they upgraded. They're going to upgrade. They haven't done it yet. A single fiber connection to a single business in his electorate for $500,000 under this program. So they're definitely quite aware that this is an ongoing election issue, but it's kind of a sleeper issue at the moment. And Labor has made moves around saying we're going to, they're going to do a lot of the same stuff that Coalition is doing, but they're saying that they're going to upgrade more fiber to the node people than are currently planned on the current government. And I think that's probably where the issue lies at the moment, because there's a lot of people that were talking to us who are essentially saying, look, I can't get decent internet, but I can see, a couple of blocks away, my neighbor has full fiber to the premises, and I don't understand why I have terrible internet and they do not.
The past, they say, is another country. It doesn't seem that long ago that Malcolm Turnbull was reassuring us that all we'd need the NBN for was to download Netflix and everything would be okay. And of course, come the pandemic and we're all in our own little version of the metaverse here, or at least sort of telecommuting and you can see when you're running events and work over this platform, when it starts lagging, it has a real impact on everyone that's involved in the collaboration, not just the individual person. Lizzie, it's always been a bit like this was the analogy of the road in terms of public infrastructure. It feels to me it's more like the health system, and you actually need to have this working, to have a healthy, connected society.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's something that people expect of government. I'm really glad that you've been looking at this issue, Josh, because sometimes I feel like the political media don't think that infrastructure stuff is interesting to citizens, and this is being an infrastructure topic, but it does sort of mean that people like Barnaby Joyce get a free pass, as though he's advocating for the bush, but in a context in which his government has kind of presided over a slapdash shoddy version of what we were originally promised when it came to the NBN. And I mean, I do always wonder why the Labor Party doesn't do more campaigning against Nationals, because I think they've got a good story to tell about investment in infrastructure and having visions for things like the NBN, but that this is something that the Coalition isn't necessarily prepared to spend money on to the level that's necessary to make it work. And this is increasingly something people have engaged with every day. It's even more than I think the health system, because every day lots and lots of people get online, and if they're not in a metro area, they struggle with connectivity issues. So it's a constant reminder that our infrastructure is deficient. So I am really glad that you're covering it, because sometimes I think journalists aren't always attuned to these issues, and it is an everyday issue for people. I mean, I think it's also clear that in the context of ongoing natural disasters and the like, that we also need a rapid response program in place to allow people to get online, even for, you know, communicating about the natural disaster itself, but also getting back up and running after some of these disasters too. And too often I think that's been left to industry, when I think the government could probably invest in that better as well. But yeah, that's I do think there's probably votes to be won on this, even more so perhaps than investment in things like roads and health and even education. Like I think I'm sort of surprised it's not campaigned on a greater level, especially given the promise that was made and the lengthy time in which the coalition sort of had to implement it and the failures that we've seen along the way.
Yeah, Toby, connectivity in your work, like how important or how destructive is a lagging internet for the sort of work you do?
I think importantly, it's a public good. I mean, we've realised we used to smile when people said that the internet is going to be considered a public good, and it clearly is. And data will always expand to meet the bandwidth available. So you have to keep on investing in it. And it's not sexy, it's not glamorous, but it will power the advances of intelligence and the like in the future.
Well, really looking forward to seeing it in print, or at least the Guardian version of print online next week, Josh. But yeah, Godspeed on that. I'm going to jump in now with and I was going to talk about President Obama's big tech intervention in a bit of a landmark speech at Stanford Uni this week. But I've also noted this morning that the White House has delivered its declaration for the future of the internet, which is in very, as Amy pointed out to me, very august font. It's been signed by 60 nations. So I was wondering if I could combine the two. So I'm going to try. So Obama, to his credit, recognises and concedes he was overly optimistic about the way the internet would transform the world. For those who remember, his administration boosted the tech sector. It famously nurtured one of the evil geniuses of surveillance capitalism, Sheryl Sandberg, the Facebook Svengali via Google. Obama is now calling for regulation and intervention and wants to reform Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the law that basically gives website platforms immunity for content of the parties. And on this, he's clearly swimming with the global tide, and there's lots of moves, as we all know, we've spoken about, to either break big tech up or in the States, or regulate it in Australia and other countries. But it seems to me, and I'm really interested in the rest of the panel's thoughts on this, the declaration on the future of the internet seems to swim in the opposite direction. So on behalf of the 60 signatories who appear to be the dwindling list of world democracies, it's basically a call for a free and open internet. And this is obviously directed immediately at Russia and more broadly China, which have both used access to the net as a tool for managing their populations. I know we discussed the difference between the architecture and the platforms with Paul Toomey a few weeks back, but it does strike me there is a dissonance emerging here. And I wonder if the free open dichotomy is the most useful way of understanding these dynamics. So Lizzie, I'm interested in your take, but also as our resident lawyer, what is the actual effect of a declaration, or is it just a press release?
Oh, that's rough, Peter. I think probably it's closer to a press release than anything enforceable, for sure. So yeah, there's a whole internet trope in the law about how international law doesn't exist, or that it's not technically enforceable. This isn't even really an international legal document. So I think it's a statement of intent and little more. I'm not sure it would be enforceable. I think it's interesting that you've kind of framed it in that way, that, how do we talk about power in the context of the internet and what negative consequences have been produced as a result of that centralization, and where is it centralized? Because I think you're right to point out that it's somewhat contradictory to Obama's recent turnaround on, I suppose, the potential of the tech industry and big tech platforms and the difficulties that they've presented for democracies around the world. But this document looks much more like about how important developing economic opportunities in a digital environment are. It explicitly talks about the multi-stakeholder model, which, as I understand it, is a clear commitment to involving the tech industry in discussions about regulation and standards, where that sometimes is controversial, certainly for civil society people, but in government settings as well, where there's an argument that perhaps tech companies have had too much power in determining what regulatory reform looks like. But this document is clearly committed and does repeat in a few occasions the discussion about the economic activity and allowing people to make use of the web in economic terms, as well as obviously in cultural and political ones too. And there is probably a bit of a contradiction there. I think it is interesting as well, of course, as somebody who advocates for digital rights, that the question of surveillance is pretty much missing when it comes to governments and how they surveil their citizens, because on that front, liberal democracies start to look a little bit too much like the authoritarians they're trying to define themselves as against, because they do engage in mass surveillance on a regular basis and share knowledge that comes about as a result of those activities. And so our friends at Access Now put out a statement that covers some of these issues and points out the fact that surveillance is left out of this discussion and this declaration. And that if democracies were interested in preserving themselves in the digital age and making their systems more robust and future-proof, then curbing the limits of the surveillance state is probably a key priority in achieving that goal. But this is not something they particularly want to contend with. So that's the other kind of issue I wanted to put in the mix in terms of discussing this declaration.
Yeah. Hey, Josh, one of the great, I think, internet contrarians, Cory Doctorow, sort of put out a response to Obama this week as well. And he accuses Obama of committing the sin of critty hype, Bensel's incredibly useful term for criticisms that repeat the self-serving myths of the subject of the critique. Every time we say that big tech is using machine learning to brainwash people, we give big tech a giant boost. And this has been something he's gone on a number of times. I'm interested in your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably does give them too much credit, I guess, for that sort of thing. I don't know. It's one of those things where it's a balance between the two. Kind of going back to Lizzie's point, it's we're in a phase now where everyone, like governments, are very sort of anti-tech now, and also the population is sort of wising up to some of the stuff the government's doing. I mean, Obama, it's kind of funny for Obama to sort of say that when it was under his administration that the Guardian revealed all the spying and collection of data that the US government was doing at the time. And so yeah, it's a bit rich. It's one of those things that I just don't really sort of buy into. And it's like, you see Australia as a signatory to that, and the current government has presided over just a vast amount of national security legislation that is going directly against people's privacy and the freedom that they have online. You've got before the election, the government was trying to bring in legislation that would effectively de-anonymize people, which does have the impact of making it much harder for people to have free and open conversation online, because they're worried about having their identities revealed, particularly if they live in countries where that they could be persecuted for their views, or even in Australia, where if someone works for a company, they say something that people don't like, they can go to the employer and try and get them fired, stuff like that. It is kind of, I don't know, it all is all very rich to me, watching from the outside when I see these sort of statements. They look very nice, and they have very good like notions and ideals, but it's always the practices things. I find this generally with Australia's statements, as well as I guess a lot of Western country statements, is that it's very much do as we say, not as we do in a lot of these cases.
Yeah. Toby, what's your position on the sort of the to and fro of regulation?
Well, I think there's a very dangerous idea to say that we just blame the algorithm, as Obama was saying in his speech, because that suggests that there's a better algorithm. We just haven't come upon the right algorithm. And I suspect it's actually the whole system as a whole. If you try to decide, what news to promote based upon likes and clicks, that whatever algorithm you have there, you're going to encourage, polarized debate, and you're going to have these flame wars, and you're going to end up with the loudest people being heard. So I think it's really dangerous and somewhat ironic coming from Obama. I have some respect for his administration, especially what he did nationally, not so much for what he did internationally. But I'm worried that he's getting amnesia, because he was the first president to weaponize social media to get himself elected. At the time, we thought it was a good thing that he was using social media to encourage young people, especially, to go out and vote, to encourage Black people to vote. We thought that was a good thing, but it was those very same ideas and algorithms that were being used, weaponized by Trump and others, for less worthy ends.
Absolutely. We all thought that the web was inherently progressive because of Obama, which has always, to me, been like the anti-Hitler. It's just, you can't make the argument because he was a once-in-a-generation politician. And if it had been carrier pigeons, I reckon we would have thought carrier pigeons were a really progressive medium, because it would have got Obama elected. But yeah. Lizzie, last news story. Google is not just telling us now how to think, but also how to write. And they launched a new feature where they're going to tell you the right words to use. What do you think of this? Is this going to improve all our collective literacy?
Yeah, there's a nice little Motherboard article about this. They talk about Clippy, which people may remember. Is Clippy an actual entity? It's hard to tell, but from Microsoft,
the cartoon, yeah,
the Microsoft paperclip that gives you suggestions for how to do things. And apparently everybody hated Clippy. I found Clippy quite a friendly character, but anyway, Clippy's been retired, and they compared this to Clippy being a prompting tool when you're using Google Documents about appropriate language to use. And it strikes me as a very American concept, because often the language, as you type it into the Google document, it will say, oh, this is a bit uninclusive, and you may want to try using these words instead. And I mean, apart from just being an abuse on language, I think as a general proposition, it does raise some concerns about how they've designed this and what the effect of those design decisions might be. The example that I think is perhaps most telling is someone has a nice little screenshot of where they use the word landlord, and this is described as potentially controversial, and that the person may wish to use the word proprietor instead, which suggests to me somehow the landlord lobby has gotten into Google's ear to say that landlords have been poorly portrayed and need to have their terminology sanitized so that people won't feel as outraged about their social position as they perhaps currently do. And I find this stuff to be so insidious, because it suggests that there's a bunch of human decisions that have gone into making this, but it looks like it has the cleanliness of an automated process, the objectivity associated with that somehow there is an agreed set of language which is not controversial, as opposed to language that is, and that we should be striving to sanitize our language from terms that might offend. And really all these things are very much subjective, culturally specific, contextual, and perhaps don't reflect the intention of the writer. And having that dictated to you as a user of a product by Google just feels so offensive. So I really hate it. I mean, I think there's some things we can also perhaps deduce about why it is that Google feels like this is an appropriate thing
service,
to do.
yeah.
But also like what kind of data set they're training on and using to identify language that's likely to be offensive. So they talk about putting in a speech from a right-wing figure and getting no, using offensive racial slurs, getting no suggestions for improvements. And then, other more lyrical texts being, sanitized to lose all their rhetorical weight. And, what I think really gives us an opportunity to query what kind of processes they're employing to deploy these tools, and what that it seems like an automated process, but it's still a human one. And I think that it's an important little porthole through which you can see how some of these bigger automated artificial intelligence concepts, processes and products get built, and why we might have pause to be critical of them, which is why I'm glad we've got Toby here today. But I just wanted to put it into the mix.
Hey, Josh, one of the saddest days of my professional career was leaving newspapers and losing the sub-editor. Like, is this any different than the backbench?
Well, I was thinking that it would be good. This is one of those kind of things where it would be good for Google to be completely transparent, and we can see the algorithmic decisions and how it was all formed. If we could see what the basis of everything was, rather than going into a black box, we might have a better understanding of how it works, and people might be more open to it. I think if it was like, if they did it as like an enterprise product, where, say, if the Guardian had it, and I could throw in our style guide, and when I'm writing a story, it would say that's not actually in your style guide. That would be a much better way of doing it in my view. Like it would save us so much time. But then that would mean that we could see where the decisions are being made. We can see this is, you can look up the style guide on our website now and see, well, these are why the decisions have been made in this particular way. I think it's the lack of transparency and the just it kind of going into a black box that I think scares people a lot. I mean, like, people already have. If you use a iPhone keyboard or something like that, it already kind of predicts what you're going to say, and that's based on how you normally talk in these sorts of programs as well. So I think everyone's kind of gotten used to that, but they don't want someone else to be dictating how they're speaking and I guess influencing the language that they're using, unless it's your employer, like in my case.
Well, Josh, we insist on the lowercase acronyms because they drive me bananas. Anyway,
I've adjusted to those. I'm
an uppercase guy. But it speaks to something bigger, which really upset me when my kids started going to high school, which is the conformity of language, right? And the conformity of telling stories. And the kids are now taught they've got to write every paragraph in a certain structure, the peel. And I feel that part of it is they're setting it up so that all their essays can be marked by computers rather than real people. But it also takes the joy and the delight out of writing, and everything's a chore. So I'm not saying that we wrote better growing up, but we had freedom to sort of express our ideas. You can just feel it all being contained and held back. And I know that's a long way from Clippy to saying that they're repressing my kids' creativity, but there is a line there, and it's this thing that there is a right way and then there are wrong ways.
I reckon legal is much more of an impact on the way I can express myself than anything else.
Yeah, Toby, I don't know if Toby's still with us. I just lost his camera, but
I'm here still.
Yeah, hello.
Lizzie, Eric Horvitz was the inventor. A friend of mine was the inventor of Clippy, and he was so upset because he said Microsoft really messed it up. They made it much more intrusive than he invented. So, but I think the fundamental challenge here is that computers don't understand language. They understand statistics about language, but they don't understand the language itself. And so we're falling into a trap of thinking that they do understand language. And actually, interestingly, there's a real worry in the machine learning community that we're going out and we're training all these systems on the internet. Literally, you crawl the whole internet, and vast bits of the internet is now text that was written by other computers, and it's eating its own dog food. And so we may end up, with these systems speaking their own version of English because that was the version that the machines were producing in the past.
I know. I find this so interesting, Toby. I mean, we're going to stray into talking about your book, but we're about to do it anyway, I think. But natural language processing, like how you teach a computer to understand natural language, there's I take your point. Maybe you can never really teach it, right? But there's a whole controversy around the fact that you might use a Google News text database as the training database for a machine to learn about how to process natural language. But inherent in that language is probably sexist terminology or racist terminology, and not even necessarily used in a oppressive way. But if you had an article about CEOs, you might point out that 80% of them are men, and so then the computer might correctly interpret that CEOs are associated with men, when in fact we might think that's problematic. And you can see how there's inherent difficulties on training a computer or seeking to train a machine on a cohort of data which is invariably biased, which then has an impact in how you might get a tool like this on a Google document where terms are flagged as controversial, which in fact reflect a value set that hasn't been properly interrogated. It's just been spat out the back of a machine that then looks neutral and objective. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, actually, some of the very earliest work in natural language processing was work where everything was trained on the Enron database. So there was a transcripts from Enron, which is a completely biased data set. I mean, it's mostly male people speaking. There's some quite rude language being used, and the tone of the conversations, you can imagine, with all of this corruption that was going on in Enron at the time, something that you wouldn't want perpetuated. But yeah, a lot of natural language programs were trained on that to begin with. Now it's more broadly the internet, but again, it's not necessarily representative of language as a whole.
But my final question before we round this, Lizzie, is it the bias that is the problem, or the tool that's the problem? Is it the very fact that we've got this tool that is telling us how to express ourselves, which is the problem?
Oh, I think they're both a problem, aren't they? I mean, even if you could train it really well, do we want Google being the people that determine what is and isn't offensive language that might need to be edited to be more inclusive? That strikes me as an extremely culturally specific conclusion that comes out of, an American tradition of, speech and engagement and politeness. And I'm not sure that you necessarily want that to be handed to a company to do in a ubiquitous product. So I can understand why it might be useful for me to get, when I'm using legal terms as well, I might be the same as you, Josh, when I'm writing legal documents. I want to have suggestions for how to do that correctly, and it might save me time, but I can't imagine that.
Oh, your whole career is going to be taken over by machines, Lizzie, isn't it?
Hey, come on. There's still some legal deductive reasoning I can contribute, but yeah, so I don't think that a company should be doing that without any transparency. And even if they did do it transparently, I think it is very difficult to do it well. I mean, this is one of my questions for Toby. What is machine learning good at doing, and what should we be asking it to do? I think there's a real question around that. And it's not the answers are not necessarily what's reflected in how it is currently being used, which is, I think, far more ubiquitously than it perhaps ought, when it can't be trusted. I don't even know how you could get it to a point to be trusted, I suppose, is my point. So I don't like it intruding into the writing process, but I don't even like the idea of it at all.
Can I use that as a segue into the deep dive, because I think we break the podcast up in two. So deep dive. So Toby, welcome. Your new book looks at the ways artificial intelligence is reshaping the world. And while you're an expert in AI, you are not a techceptionalist. And I love your critical eye. And the way, I think, rare in an academic, we actually, I think, have the mind of a tabloid reporter as well. So respect. So
I hope that's a compliment.
Totally, as a former tabloid reporter.
You mean I make it accessible, not that I make it sensational?
Well, I've always been a big fan of the tabloid format. I think you reduce things down to its core, and that's what you do. So I just wanted to start with one quote from your book and then maybe open up. So you say, with or without emotions, artificial intelligence may be very different to human intelligence. When I talk about AI in public, I remind people to focus on the word artificial as much as the other word intelligence. AI may be very artificial. It may be very different form of intelligence than natural intelligence that we have. So this is out of Machines Behaving Badly that will be released this week. So before we go in, apart from contractual obligations, what was the motivation for this book?
It was because people like you and journalists would ring me up pretty much every day and ask me questions largely about fails of the tech industry, questions about the ethics of what was going on. And I wanted to think through carefully the issues for myself and try and explain, at least from a technical perspective, where I saw the issues arising. And this isn't the first technology that's touched our lives. And most of the time I was saying, but if this wasn't digital, if this was people doing this in the real world, you'd be upset as well. This is just old-fashioned bad behavior. And we should be upset at the tech companies behaving badly just because they're using digital tools to do it. We should, also a wake-up call, I think, for politicians and regulators saying, wait a second, we can't let this space, now it is one of the most important industry sectors out there. We need to think carefully about how we apply existing laws, and I don't think we apply existing laws forcefully enough to the tech space, and where we might need new laws, not because there are new ethical problems. I think there's a lot of ethical washing going on, but certainly the technology lets us break things, quicker, faster, cheaper than we have in the past, and we may need to make sure that we rein in the worst behaviors.
I was actually talking to one of your colleagues this morning, who I won't name, who said the thing about Toby is a lot of the work he does is actually pretty boring, particularly around transport logistics, which I think it's interesting to start with a really useful use of AI to create more efficient, environmentally friendly flows.
Yeah. So yeah, I do stuff routing trucks more smartly, so that it saves 10% of the transport bill of a big multinational company here in Australia, and that's very good for their bottom line. But also, it's very good for the planet. That's 10% less CO2 every year, because pretty much all of that cost saving is in diesel fuel.
So where is the point where you go from, or what is the inflection point between a useful application of the technology and where you see problems emerging?
But even there, we worried about, are we pushing the drivers too hard now? Because we're actually getting them to work more efficiently. They're not wasting as much time as they used to. Are the drivers going to be happy? And so it was really important to me when we did that work that not only did the company come back to me and say, well, we've reduced our transport bill. They're spending $80 million a year on transport. We've reduced that transport bill by 10%. But the drivers' satisfaction has gone up. That was actually, I think, for me, as important as saying that we'd save the money and reduce their CO2 footprint, was that the drivers were happier. But that wasn't a given.
So can I ask you, Toby, it seems to me that I think this is a really important contribution, because you're obviously extremely well credentialed in this field. And it's really important, I think, for people with that kind of stature to question and criticize some of the worst excesses of the industry, of government use of AI as well. But it did seem to me as well, or maybe I'm reading too much into the text, but there was probably a point at which you started to notice that there were big problems that needed fixing, or that you perhaps shifted from someone who was very optimistic and perhaps a utopian about technology towards someone who is becoming more critical. Am I reading that right? Was there a point at which that occurred, or do you think that you still encounter colleagues who are extremely optimistic or less critical than you about the potential of the field, and you've shifted from where you were, or what's the process? Because this book feels a little bit like a productive reflection of your time in the space and the problems that you've encountered again and again.
It is. I think that's a reflection, I think, of many of my colleagues' journey in the last half a dozen years. If you went back half a dozen years, most of us weren't too worried about the impact of what we were doing, because most of it was still stuck in the laboratory. But in the last half a dozen years, it really has very rapidly not only left the laboratory, but start to have impacts, some of them positive and some of them somewhat negative. And with that comes, I think, a huge responsibility. I mean, I don't think these aren't questions that people like myself should be answering as a whole. I should be contributing to these conversations. That's what part of the book was to try and inform people about, at least from a technical perspective, what are the opportunities, what are the risks. But these are technologies that touch all of society, and all of society should be involved in those conversations. We need lawyers like yourself to help us think through how we need to regulate properly. We need politicians to be engaged. We need all of civil society, because it touches all of civil society to be involved. And so from everyone, from the youngest person to the oldest person in society, they need to be thinking about, ultimately what sort of society we will build, because these technologies are going to help us build the society of tomorrow. And there are lots of choices. There are good futures that we could have, and there are not so good futures. And you only have to look at places like China to see you can use these technologies in ways that we will find very, very challenging, to surveil the population, to suppress minorities, to impose authoritarian rule upon a state. Equally, they can be used to enhance democracy. We saw that in the Arab Spring. We see these technologies being used to give voice to people who previously didn't have voice. But that equally, we see Twitter being used by QAnon and people to spread untruths and to promote vaccine hesitancy, lots of things that are not actually helpful to society.
Hey, Josh, so
sorry.
I just saw Josh for a sec. So when I see AI reported in the media, it's almost like it's cure for cancer stories or it's the world's going to end stories. What challenges do you have as a journo trying to get the nuance into talking about issues like this?
Well, I think like a little bit sort of to what Toby was saying is that I think a lot of the issues that we see with AI in how we report it is just in terms of for every time you want to blame AI, say something that's gone wrong, it's always sort of come back to there was a human at the start of the process that put these ideas in and stuff up. The one that I always think of is like robo-debt, for example, where they knew what they were doing and it was a foreseeable outcome, and yet they still went ahead with it, and all these people started getting letters that shouldn't have gotten letters because they just averaged the income over an entire year. And yeah, I think that's one of the things that I constantly think. I think probably my question to Toby would be, so it's a cliche at this point that that regulation often lags very, very much behind tech, and they're constantly left catching up. Are we at a point yet where it's too late, where things have gone too far, or is there still sort of an opportunity to sort of get in early and sort of set the rules around these things before it gets away from us?
Oh, I'm sure it's not too late to regulate. I mean, in some places, I think it is just applying existing law, saying that existing law applies to the digital space as much as it applies to the real world. I mean, the fact that Facebook continued for a number of years to offer housing adverts that were racially profiled, where there's actually a federal law that prohibits that. Why didn't the regulator step in more vigorously and force them to stop discriminating against people based on race for housing adverts and job adverts when there was actually a federal law to prevent it? But equally, I think we're waking up to the idea that it is very worthwhile and necessary to regulate the digital space. We see, especially in Europe, lots of progress on that, but equally, we've seen regulation here in Australia, and I think what's interesting is to see that probably the most appropriate level at which to regulate is at the national level, and that is actually remarkably effective, even though these are multinational companies with global footprints. Why was it that the tech companies pushed back so hard about the media bargaining rules? Is because they realized that Australia was going to set a very important precedent, and it did. France has very similar laws. Other countries are adopting those laws now because you can set a really important precedent. And indeed, if you want to have impact, I think it's worth thinking about most of the regulation. Effective regulation is going to happen by our national governments realizing that the worst excesses need to be reined in.
I covered a court case the other week. I'm sure you're familiar with. There was an inventor who was trying to get his AI inventions patented, and in Australia he was unsuccessful, but he appealed it to the federal court and then won that case. And then on the full appeal earlier this month, that overturned the appealing. So, I thought the comments in the judgment were quite interesting in that they kind of hedged it a little bit. They were saying, we're not really sort of discussing the question about whether AI can actually be an inventor in this particular case, but we see that as more of a role of the parliament to make a decision, then we'll interpret that legislation. So it's interesting that they were very much keen to be seen as, the courts aren't going to decide this. This is something for the parliament to actually decide when it comes to that.
I have to say, though, I do sort of, sorry, you go, Toby.
No, you go.
Lizzie, no, Lizzie.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I understand the importance of regulation. I know it's really easy to criticize regulators for being slow or the law for being slow, but equally what I would say is, Clearview AI, I think, is a really interesting example where our privacy regulator here has said basically that they broke the law in scraping publicly available on social media platforms, photos used to train their machine learning program, or their program that was based on machine learning using data sets that were essentially stolen. And Clearview AI has just ignored it. They are continuing to sell their products to law enforcement agencies around the world and the like. And I do wonder whether we also do need bans, like whether before we talk about making the process of generating artificial intelligence products ethical, we also need to say, well, no, some of this stuff shouldn't happen at all. And I wondered what you thought about that, Toby, whether you thought that we do need to start thinking about some of these questions from an original sin almost perspective, like, do we want to proceed down this path at all? And can we rely on data sets that have been obtained without consent, that are problematic and biased for all sorts of reasons? Can we ever correct properly for that in using machine learning? So does the question kind of predate the creation of the product or the service? What do you think about that as a potential way of regulating or at least enforcing community standards on the field?
It's interesting to see that in a number of places that they're actually forcing algorithms to be deleted where they've been trained on data that was obtained in controversial circumstances. I think we'll see a lot more of that. But equally, I think we will see more red lines being drawn. We see this in the new EU AI Act. There are certain uses of certain technologies that will be prohibited in Europe. The fundamental challenge you have is that these are all dual use technologies. So you take something like face recognition, and I'm increasingly of the view that perhaps we should just not allow face recognition. There are just so many harms that can be done with it, so many invasions of our privacy, so many ways that it can be misused that probably we shouldn't just allow it. But equally, there are positive uses. There are a number of examples. There were thousands of children in orphanages in Delhi who were lost and reunited with their parents using face recognition software. It's used by a number of NGOs around the world to combat child pornography and child trafficking. An immense evil. And you can't possibly scan all the faces on the internet by eye, but you can get algorithms to do that, facial recognition algorithms to do that. So there's a great evil that's being combated with facial recognition. But equally, as you say, Clearview is the tech model of ignoring regulation, the same one that Uber and others have done.
Clearview is also being used apparently by the Ukrainian army to identify captured Russian soldiers and then ring their mums. Now,
ring them mums, but also it's going to be used to help prosecute war crimes. So people, video and footage of soldiers committing war crimes will be used in face recognition. So again, positive uses and negative uses. It never goes away with this technology.
I remember you've also been a strong advocate to ban drone warfare, and I'm interested in your reflections on that, just watching what's going on, I guess, in Ukraine at the moment, but also in the context of the Australian election, where it seems two things have happened. Labor's actually committed to a big tech military project, and the coalition's dropped its drone project, which was several $1 billion. So what's going on there?
Well, just to be precise, I'm not against drone warfare, and indeed,
oh, you're pro drone warfare. Yeah,
I'm not pro drone warfare. I'm against autonomous warfare, against handing over the decision to algorithms. Always, we should leave humans in charge, and I think it's inevitable. We're going to see more and more use of drones, and you see it in Ukraine, you see it in Syria and elsewhere. You see, how do you took down the Russian warship? It was with a drone distraction. So we're going to see more and more uses of drones, and Australia's again doesn't seem to know how to buy weapons. We've just cancelled the 1.2 billion drone program that we had in favour of spending on our cyber defence. We should spend more money on cyber defense, but we shouldn't do it at the expense of weapons that will be useful, like drones. But again, you ask yourself, well, how did we end up spending 1.2 billion on 12 drones? Drones are supposed to be cheap and cheerful, not $100 million each, which is more expensive. I looked it up, more expensive than an F-35 fighter with people on board it. So again, we seem to have completely stuffed up in how we procure weapons and how we modernize our military.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Toby, is you talk a bit about autonomous vehicles in your book, and I think you're probably more of a fan of autonomous vehicles than I am. And partly that's because I feel like sometimes we think of utility in solving problems that without necessarily looking at the broader context for the problem. There's understandably a desire to reduce the road toll, which is huge, and often a bit of a silent problem in some ways, because we don't really acknowledge it and we attribute it to driver behavior and perhaps don't think about how we could do things differently. And that there's an investment in autonomous vehicles on the basis that it will be reduced. But to my mind, sometimes these technological answers conceal the context of this problem. Like, why are we building cities designed around car use, and why are we building communities and places where people live, where the only way to get around is by a car, that gives rise to these big road tolls? And maybe there's alternatives to that. And are we just doing boosterism for the automotive industry, especially in a context where autonomous vehicles always feel 2 to 3 years away? And I wondered if that's part of the kind of techno-optimism or utopianism that comes with this field, that sometimes we can try to solve one problem while realizing that there's a context in which that problem could be solved without this kind of technology. I don't know whether you had any thoughts on that.
I support your claims that we should be more worried about our local neighborhoods. I mean, certainly one of the silver linings of the pandemic was we realized that there were the importance of the parks in our local communities. We valued the built environment around us, and we should do more to do that. But equally, I'm unashamed in thinking that we need to use driver aids, not just autonomous vehicles, but driver aids to reduce the toll that traffic accidents have upon us. 1,000 people will die in road accidents in Australia in the next year. If you survive childbirth in Australia, your major cause of death until the age of about 35 is car traffic accident. It's not cancer, it's not anything else. It's being hit by a car. And 95% of those accidents are caused by driver error. They're not caused by mechanical failure or trees falling over. It's caused by human stupidity. It's caused by humans who are tired, humans who are texting, humans who are unfortunately still sometimes drunk. And that will go away. It's not just going to be autonomous cars. It's going, already we have lots of autonomous assistants that automatically brakes and tells us that someone's in our blind spot. We're increasingly relying upon those devices, and those are reducing. Road traffic deaths are going down with those aids that we now all assume are going to be there.
The background noise suggests you're about to embark on your book tour, Toby. I guess my final question to round this out is, where do you want to see the public debate around AI go? And I go back to that thing, it's either great or terrible. And how do you actually build a bit more of a sense of human agency into the discussion?
I think you're right. It's entirely about saying, well, we need to make the choices that we don't want it to be what the tech industry forces upon us. It will be, what sort of society do we want it to be? And we can go back and look at history. I mean, we have a very good precedent here, which was the Industrial Revolution. When we industrialized and we changed the nature of work, we introduced factories. We did a lot of things, not to do with technology, but to do with the society. We introduced unions and labor laws and the welfare state and universal education, so that all of us got to rise on the prosperity that automation brought to manufacturing. And we need to think, I think, equally radically. We're going to go through an equally radical transformation. And we need to all think about, how do we make sure that everyone is brought along? And that isn't just technology. It's all about, how do we make sure that the corporations' values are aligned with the public good, and that we share some of the benefits around.
Last thoughts and reflections, Josh and Lizzie. Got a couple of minutes left.
I was just thinking in terms of the automated vehicle discussion, that's going to be an interesting one to watch. I sort of take Toby's point about how these, the evolutions kind of change how people feel about it. But I feel like there's a sort of fight coming in if we do move to automated vehicles, because it's one of those things where people just like to have control of what they're doing and like to drive and like to be in charge. And
Josh, I think you're like the horse owner
Yes.
150 years ago, saying no one's going to get off their horses. They're not going to want this new technology coming along. They want to be in charge of their own horse.
I hope that's it. Like, because I can see, particularly post like now that people are starting to go back into the office and things like that, but people are still quite scared of using public transport, that the amount of traffic that is on the road has gone up so much. And I was just thinking that if it was much more automated and it would be much more efficient and things would be much better, I think. But I can still just see that fight looming of the hurdle of people willing to relinquish control of driving.
Yeah, I feel like as a class actions lawyer, I think all the time about who's liable for these products and whether private companies are prepared to invest in the infrastructure if they're going to be held liable for when it doesn't perform correctly. And I do wonder whether that becomes a reason why it's endlessly put off, or it becomes the situation where if you're not using that autonomous functionality, then it's on you rather than the maker of the product and how you pass these things out. I mean, I think regulation in terms of making laws is one way in which we can regulate this, but I do actually think there's a role to play around holding companies responsible for products they create, because they can be really harmful. And often they, the Pinto example, which I do talk about in my book, but is this case study that's used in law schools of how companies rush products to market with full knowledge that it will probably kill people. And, there are other products that actually do kill people, and making and factoring that into the cost of doing business. So, can we trust companies to do this work when people's lives are on the line? I think there's a real question around that.
Well, interestingly, Lizzie, the next thing to follow on in the EU after the EU AI Act is a focus on product liability around digital technologies.
Music to my ears, Toby.
For those sorts of reasons, we have to make sure that the technologies, people are held, the companies are held liable for introducing technologies when the petrol tank explodes.
Hey, Toby, thanks for your time. I know it's always challenging to do it in the airport lounge, and you've battled on manfully there with the announcements in the background. You sent me a bunch of invites. Can I share those in the chat with everyone if anyone wants to come to any broader discussions of your books, or are they kind of special affairs? I'll chuck them in the chat. And there's a whole bunch of events, including one that involves free breakfast, which I'll be at. So thank you so much for your time today. Yeah. Good luck with the book. And hey, Lizzie and Josh, thank you both for your time today. And thanks everyone for joining us. This will also be posted as a podcast, probably over the weekend if you want to share it with any of your friends. And we'll be back in a fortnight, which will be the last one before the federal election. We have put a call out to various candidates to join us, and we haven't quite, but most people are having trouble getting debates between ministers and shadows at the moment, I might add. But we might try to find someone that's got their head really around the different policy platforms of the two sides to at least have a bit of a chat about where the election's going to go in a fortnight's time. So have a great weekend, everyone. And thanks for being part of Burning Platforms today.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Toby.
If people hang on for a sec, I will very badly try to put, I can't cut and paste. God, I'm hopeless. This is normally the whole.
Okay, Boomer. Good to see your cat made an appearance, Josh.